Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing out there? Great. Hey, my name is Jeremy. I'm the lead pastor here at Redemption Gilbert. We're glad that you're here with us this morning, particularly if you're here as a guest, first time with us. We want to extend a special welcome to you and let you know we're glad that you're here with us. It's a big week. We are both closing out our Sermon on the Mount series. We are finishing our 12th Sunday in the Sermon on the Mount, trying to close it up. And it's Thanksgiving prep weekend, so I play a very important role this week, which is my wife's sous chef. So I've been working on my chopping skills and making sure that I'm ready to take directions from her on Thanksgiving morning, which is one of my favorite things. But there's a lot of preparation that goes into hosting holiday events. And so next weekend, we're going to begin with our promotion for Advent and for Christmas Eve that's coming. And so since you're here today, you get the family inside baseball pitch. And so here's what it really looks like. I need some sous chefs, some people to help out around the church for Christmas Eve, in particular for kids and guest services. We have regular volunteer staff that mans these Sunday services, but when Christmas Eve or holidays come around and they don't fall on a regular weekend day, there's extra needs in order to make sure that we're ready to host all the guests that are going to be here for these events. So this is a special opportunity for you to step up and serve in a kids classroom for an hour or help out in guest services and make sure that we can meet it. I can see the way that you're awkwardly avoiding my gaze right now to make sure that I'm not looking at you, but I am. I'm looking directly at you. If you feel it, good. That's right. And I'm also filling time so that you can put your phone at that thing and make sure you get the link. But don't worry, if you miss it, you're going to get emails and communication about doing it. We'd love to have your help because these are great opportunities to meet people and to serve our community. We're continuing and closing out our Sermon on the Mount series. One of the things that we've been talking about as we've been working through this is the challenge of taking 3 months to work through a 20-minute sermon that Jesus gave. So I went to Google this week and I put in, I need a synonym for an overview, and the one that I chose, which I thought was great, is French, the Tour de Horizon. I don't know if that's how you say it, but it sounded fancy. What it means is exactly what it sounds like. It's a tour of the horizon. So we today are going to take time to kind of fly over the entire Sermon on the Mount before we land to finish it out, the last 10 or so verses, and how Jesus closes up this moment that he has. And the Sermon on the Mount, the more that I've spent time with it and been thinking about it and reading through it again this week, trying to get the overview, I realized is that this is really the revolution on the Mount. To quote the great artist, the Beatles, who wrote in their song Revolution, you say you want a revolution? Well, we all want to change the world. My wife has a sign in our kitchen that says we all want a revolution, but nobody wants to do the dishes. And I think that summarizes it really well, right? We all want to see the world change. We all want things to be made better. We all want to see an overturning of the order that rules our world as the way it is. We all have things that we're unhappy about or wish were different. But what are we really looking to do to engage in the revolution that really brings change? And I think that's what the Sermon on the Mount gives us. Here's a quote that I found from I think he was late 19th century Spanish philosopher who was there during the Spanish Revolution and things that were going on. He says this about revolution. Revolution is not an uprising against pre-existing order. It's a setting up of a new order that's contradictory to the old one. Today, as we look at the Sermon on the Mount from a distance and kind of gaze over what Jesus is trying to do, he's not trying to overthrow the order that exists. He's saying there is an order that sits next to it and is opposed to the one that has ruled all of our lives. The best part about a revolution, the best part about transformation in society in a deep way is a good old manifesto. You got to love a manifesto. Here's the problem with the idea of a manifesto. It's been tainted a little bit because now when you hear the word manifesto, typically what you're going to think about, if you're anything like me, is you're going to think about the Unabomber, and he's writing his manifesto, which is usually some barely coherent, crazed writings of someone who's trying to argue their way through the world. But that's unfair. Manifestos are really great. In fact, I think that we all subscribe to one of the greatest manifestos ever written, the Declaration of Independence. We don't call it a manifesto, but that's exactly what it was. It was a document stating, here's who we are, and here's what we're going to see that's different, and here's who we will be. There's great manifestos out there. The Magna Carta was one that changed the way that we viewed power in the world. Luther hammered his 95 Thesis on the door of the church in Geneva. It was a manifesto of the way we saw living in the world going forward. We can have lots of discussions about what it brought to the table as far as government and impact, but the Communist Manifesto written by Karl Marx is a cogent argument from his perspective. And what we have here today, I think, is a manifesto. If a manifesto is described this way, a document that publicly declares the position or program of its issuer. A manifesto advances a set of ideas, opinions, or views, and it can lay out a plan of action. Here's one of my favorite manifestos in the world. It's called The Trail of Political Consciousness. It's also known as Niemiec's Manifesto. Two nerds in the room know where I'm going with this. Here's a quote from it. It says, "There will be times when the struggle seems impossible. I know this already. You're alone, unsure, and dwarfed by the scale of the enemy." Doesn't that kind of feel like what it is like to be a Christian sometimes? A little nervous. It feels like the struggle might be impossible, that we're being dwarfed by the enemy that surrounds us. This is actually a quote from the TV show Andor, because this is a quote from the manifesto of the rebellion that started the rebellion against the empire. A good manifesto says, here's who we are, and here's what needs to change, and here's how we're going to achieve it. And I would argue that the Sermon on the Mount is a kingdom manifesto, because it publicly declares the position and program of the kingdom, and the Sermon on the Mount advances a set of ideas and lays out a plan of action. If you are a Christian, you are not living an easy, lazy life going along with everyone else. You are part of a world-changing revolution. And this sermon is the manifesto that says, here are our ethos, and here is our direction, and here's the action that we're going to take. So this morning, as we look at the Sermon on the Mount and where it goes, I've tried to lay out, I think it's maybe a dozen points that I think the sermon is trying to make that lay out what does it look like to be a part of the kingdom. Would you join me in praying that God would be with us this morning as we work through this? God, we thank you so much for this time that we've had to work through the Sermon on the Mount, to wrestle with your carefully honed message of the kingdom. God, to hear the words of Jesus laid out, to study them, to really contemplate and chew on them has been a challenge and a blessing. And we pray that this morning we would be challenged and blessed again. God, you've been good, and we ask you to continue to be good to your people. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. The kingdom, according to the Sermon on the Mount, is found in surprising places. One of the things that opens the Sermon on the Mount is one of its best known texts, which we call the Beatitudes, and which tells us here's where you're going to go look to find where the ethos of the kingdom is at work. And the place that he tells us to look is a surprising place. And he gives us a list of people who will be blessed by the coming of the kingdom. And he says, these are not the kind of people you typically look for. In fact, he says, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, who mourn, who are meek, who are merciful, who have pure hearts, and are peacemakers. Typically, when we look for political upheaval and overriding of societal systems, or we're looking for a revolution, we're looking for the exact opposite kind of people. We're looking for loud, we're looking for charismatic, we're looking for people who will bring it to the battlefield. We're looking for people who are aggressive and forceful. We're looking for people who are sly. We're looking for people who can pull one over on their neighbors in strategic warfare. And yet Jesus says the kingdom comes and you're going to find it in a very surprising kind of place. You're going to find it among these kind of people. People who are broken in spirit, people who mourn over the state of the world, people who are meek in their approach to their neighbors, people who are merciful to each other and to their enemies, people who are pure in heart, wholehearted, and people who pursue peace. Why are those people blessed? Because when the kingdom comes in fullness, which is inevitable, they will be blessed because they will get the thing their heart wants most. Their broken heart will be healed. Their mourning will come to rejoicing. Because of their meekness, they will be close to the Father who has control over all things. Their mercy will be rewarded. Their pureness in heart will allow them to see God, and peace will exist in all places. That's the place that the kingdom is found. If you want to know where to see the kingdom at work today, look for these kinds of people. He continues and he says that the kingdom is a public truth and a public blessing. It's a very popular idea today. In fact, it's one of the phrases that really bothers lots of people. I hear them say it when somebody says, "That's my truth." The idea that you have things that you have settled within yourself personally that are true for you, but that truth doesn't actually pour over to your neighbor or your friends or the community in which you live or your society because it's a private truth. And the Sermon on the Mount does not allow you a private truth in this. He says, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden, so let your light shine before others. He says that what the Sermon on the Mount brings to the world is a public truth that overrides everything else. And when you live out that truth is a public blessing. Because people can't help but seeing who you are and how you live and what your community is like. Jesus is tying all the way back to an idea that was taught from the prophet Jeremiah when Israel was in exile in Babylon, when they had been taken off from their homeland and forced to resettle in this foreign place. And Jeremiah says, here's how you're going to do it. Be faithful to God and seek the blessing of your city and your neighbor, because when you do that, you too will be blessed. Jesus says that the kingdom, when it comes, is the same way. He invites us and he says, can you be anything else other than preserving salt in the world? Can you be anything else other than light in the world? Can you actually hide the kingdom when it's at work in you? No. So let your light shine before others so that they will bring glory to your Father who's in heaven. I love this idea. We want to have, maybe you felt it, you want to have a good, strong argument for the things that you believe. You'd love to be able to outlogic your neighbor when he brings his strong opinion about something, and you could say, here's what I think and why I think it. And I think Jesus says that's not actually the way to defend your faith. The way to defend your faith is to live it in a way that cannot be denied. Because when you do that, people will be drawn to that kingdom like a city on a hill. He continues and he says that the kingdom is the fulfillment of the story. I anticipate that Jesus is saying this because he's responding to active criticism coming at him from religious leaders in Israel at the time who were saying, Jesus, we like you in your new ideas. We like you in the controversial things that you say. The problem is they don't line up with our history and our tradition. You're teaching something other than we have taught. And Jesus says, don't you dare. Because that's not true. Don't think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to get rid of our entire story, our entire history, our entire arc. In fact, I've not come to abolish them. I've come to fulfill them. Everything you've been looking for, hoping for, dreaming about, looking to the future, trying to find the leader that will lead you to that place, I am him and I am here. Because I'm the fulfillment of the story you've been living in. You need to know that when you're a part of a Christian church, when you're a part of a Christian community, when you are a part of a people who studies the Word and looks at Jesus week after week, you're not just listening to interesting wisdom, you're participating in the story that's telling the true history of the entire world and where it's going. And that's a pretty exciting thing to be a part of. He continues and he says, the kingdom runs a lot deeper than you think. And he has a whole section in the Sermon on the Mount where he begins to talk about traditional teaching that would have been a part of their cultural reality. And these are not even unique teachings. The idea that you shouldn't murder someone, that you shouldn't lie, that you shouldn't sleep with someone else's spouse, those are very common ideas that would have been popular amongst many cultures alongside Israel. And Jesus says, it's a lot deeper than just your behavior. He says this, I tell you, anyone who's angry with your brother or sister will be subject to judgment, and anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. He says, you don't want to murder someone? Great. You've refrained from adultery? Amazing. What about the heart that's within you that brought it out? When someone insults you, and you refrain from giving a throat punch right here, good job. You get a cookie. What he really wants to say is, are we ever going to deal with the part of your heart that made you have to restrain the throat punch to begin with? The part of you where that anger is welling up from that you had to hold back? Congratulations, you didn't sleep with your neighbor's spouse. It's not exactly a high bar to clear. But he says in the kingdom, what he's actually getting at is the heart that's within you that desires something that is not yours, is not good for you, and damages your community. Are you going to deal with that part of you? Because the kingdom runs a lot deeper than you think that it does. He continues and he says, what I think might be the most challenging part of the entire series: the kingdom avoids retaliation and loves enemies. This is actually the sermon that Corey taught for us, and I didn't get to teach this one, so you're going to get a little bit of me teaching this one here. The reality is, Jesus is talking to an area that is influenced by two political parties in Israel's life right then: the religious conservatives, the Pharisees, and the military rebels, the Zealots. And both of them had a different approach on how we're going to be faithful to God and how we're going to carry this out. One of them says we're going to obey all the rules down to the smallest detail. And the other one says the rules don't matter as long as the Romans are here. We're going to kill them and we're going to get rid of them. That's how we're going to do it. And Jesus is addressing an audience being influenced by both of these voices. And so when he says, I tell you, don't resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. When he says, when someone forces you to carry their stuff for a mile, carry it a second mile for them. When he says, when someone asks you for their coat, your coat, give it to them and give them your cloak also. He's dealing with a real physical reality that's going on. Here's what we could interpret this to say. When those Roman soldiers that you hate so much impose upon you in your life in a way that you cannot stand, the way to actually get back at them is not to fight, because that fight leads to death. Instead, it's to rebel in a functional way that brings real shame on their injustice. They slap you, you give them the other cheek and say, would you like to take another turn? They take from you, give them to the point that you have nothing and they are shamed for what they have stolen from you. And then he says the part that I can't even believe he puts on us. He says, oh, so you love your friends and people who are kind to you. Great, doesn't everybody do that? I have something else to tell you to do. I want you to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Whew. There's a lot of things I get to do as a pastor that I really like. They're really fun things to do. Marriage counseling probably didn't make the fun things to do list, but it is a thing that I do. And part of the reason that marriage counseling isn't always fun is not because I don't like talking with people and helping them in their relationships. It's because almost no one shows up in my office for marriage counseling when they're like, hey, we had our first fight last night, and we'd love to talk about how we can avoid that in the future. That sounds kind of fun. Usually it is, this has been going on for 10 years, and we have built separate kingdoms from each other, and we hate each other's guts. And really, we're kind of checking a box right now to say we tried everything before we pursue a divorce. And that's not a very fun conversation to have. But I have two tricks that I've started doing in those situations. And now if you come to me for marriage counseling, first of all, I'd love to talk with you. Second of all, you're going to know my tricks now, so you could try them yourself. Here's my two tricks. The first thing I do when I'm trying to hear people's story is I tell them, would you tell me about when you met each other and fell in love and what that was like? I'm trying to derail them from a train that they're on of hatred and bitterness and try to get them onto a different kind of track they probably haven't visited for a while, which is love and remembering what it was like when things weren't like this. And the second one is actually a real trick. I say, here's what I'm giving you homework this week to come back for our second meeting. You have one piece of homework, and here's what it is. I want you to pray for your spouse this week. And then I let it sit, then I go, and I don't mean, God, please let them stop being such a hopeless jerk. God, please let them see I'm right all the time and they're wrong. No, pray for them that God would bring the kind of flourishing and blessing in their life that you think he would want of children that he loves and dotes on? What would it look like for your spouse to see incredible blessing and flourishing in their life? Pray for that for them. Because I believe that what Jesus tells us here about praying for our enemies and seeking love for them derails hatred. It's really hard to hate someone and pray for their blessing in the same breath. It's really hard. You get to do one or the other. And so if you commit to loving your enemy, and I will confess, this one's really hard. It's really hard. And what Jesus is inviting us to is a kingdom that asks us to live a wholehearted life before God. He has a whole series of religious practices that he addresses, which would have been normative in the life of the Israelites he was teaching to. He talks about prayer, and he talks about giving to the poor, and he talks about fasting, and he says, here's the temptation that you're going to have. What you're going to do is you're going to go through these activities in order to feel good about yourself and to make yourself look better before your neighbors. And he doesn't say that that isn't an outcome that comes. He says, you're looking for something good, you got it. You feel good, and you think that you look good in front of them. Congratulations, you've won what you'd like. And he says, wholehearted life says, that's not why I do it. What I actually am here to do is to live a true and wholehearted life before God, and he who sees what is done in secret will see what I've done and reward me. This one's hard. We live in a society that invites you to prepare and produce a polished version of yourself to the world. That's what social media is really about. And then you go, well, not me, I'm real. When I'm on social media, I post the real me. I get to the dark underbelly and I go, congratulations, you also produced a version of yourself you want us to see. Everyone does it. And he says in the kingdom, we're looking for wholehearted, all the way down to those deep parts of you. And you can do it because the kingdom is a risk-free investment strategy. He talks about how we deal with money, our time, our resources, our gifts. And he says, wherever you give yourself, your money and your things to, that's where your heart will be invested. And he invites us to really consider, where are we investing our time, talents, and finances? Where are we investing our hope? Are we investing it at a place that you could lose, someone could steal, it could be destroyed, and even if all of that is avoided, at some point you're going to die like all of us do, and you'll have none of it with you? Or would you like to invest it in a place that is risk-free and will return year after year all the way into eternity? And then he just cuts to the chase. He says, here's the deal. You can't serve God and money. You're going to pick one, and that's going to direct your life. But here's the good news. The kingdom is abundant. He says, if you seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, all these things will be given to you as well. He confronts the worry that we have that drives our life, that says, if I don't worry about these things, if I don't defend myself, if I don't build my wealth, if I don't build my reputation, I will not have. And he says, that's absolutely untrue. If you commit your life to seeking after the kingdom and seeking after righteousness, everything you need will be there for you. And you might say, but you don't know my situation. Things are tenuous for us. You might be right. I would propose that Jesus is making two arguments with us. One is this: what you think you need might be something that you want, and those two things are very different, because he knows what you need. And that's more wise than what you think you want. The second thing is, the very place that I believe that God will provide for you in your need is from the rest of us fulfilling his call in our life to be generous and kind to one another. If there is anyone among you who does not have enough to eat or a place to rest his head or clothes to wear, what good is it for you to say, be blessed and go on your way? We're going to talk about that in James as we get there. The reality is God will provide in your faithfulness as we all are faithful, and he will meet your needs. The good news is that the kingdom is self-reflective and it's gracious. We're getting close to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, in which he tells us, when you judge people, that same measure that you use in judgment will be the one that you will be judged by. And then he says, and here's the way to go about it. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to take the plank out of your eye so that you can then see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Now, this is why I think that is such a brilliant statement, because what he says is, if you're focused on dealing with the gigantic plank in your eye, you have to deal with it and solve it and clear it up in order to see clearly to help you with your speck in your eye. And I would just posit to you, when is it in your life that you will be done dealing with the log in your eye, the plank in your eye? I don't know, but if I had to guess, it is essentially a quarter of a second after I hear this sound. Beep! You will not finish wrestling with the plank in your own eye until your life is over and you are in eternity. So therefore, where is the time that you have to be worrying about the speck in your brother's eye? And I'm telling you, you want nothing more than to be a part of a community that is concerned about, how do I deal with my stuff? How do I become faithful in front of God? How do I live a life of righteousness? How do I confess who I really am? If you're concerned with that, and if your neighbor's concerned with that, you're not going to be in a judgmental community. You're going to be in a really healthy one, because they're living in the kingdom manifesto. You might say, man, that sounds hard. That's a lot of stuff you just laid on us. 20-minute sermon. I think I understood why we took 3 months. That's a lot of stuff. Well, the good news is the kingdom provides what you require to live it. Tyler taught a couple weeks ago on this section: ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened. And he did a great job. And one of the questions that this text brings all the time to the surface, especially when you pull it out of the context and you give it to someone, is you say, okay, so you're telling me anything I want at any time, anything I desire, I can just ask for it and he'll give it to me? That's an obvious problem, because the first part of that problem is that's not my experience. The second part of my problem is that doesn't seem very wise of God. Just give me anything I want anytime I ask for it. You put it back in the context and you say, I've just listened to what it looks like to live in the kingdom, and that sounds hard, maybe almost impossible. I don't know how I could live it out, because I know who I am, and I know what my struggles are, and I know how hard this is. And he says, seek, and it will be given to you. Ask, you'll find it. Knock, and the door will be opened. It is hard. It is more than you're capable of. It is something that you cannot muster up on your own. The good news is the kingdom brings the resources you need to live it out. The Spirit will empower you, and the community will stand alongside you as you pursue this kind of kingdom. That's good news. The reality, though, is the kingdom is particular and it's hidden. It's probably not news to you. You have come to... Well, I'm not going to assume it's not news to you. I'm going to say it right now. I did say there might be guests in the room. You're at a Christian church. I am a Christian pastor. I teach about and follow Jesus. Now, if that is all true, it's probably also not surprising that I'm going to tell you right now something that is shocking. The only way to God is through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's it. And you might feel that sounds narrow, and you might feel that sounds restrictive, and you might feel like that doesn't sound fair, and I don't know what to tell you, because the Sermon on the Mount reinforces this idea. Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. What size is the gate to life? I don't know exactly, but it's probably about 5'5" and 125 pounds, which is, I'm guessing, about what a really thin guy named Jesus that lived 2,000 years ago looked like. It's small, it's narrow, there's one way, And everyone out there, many people are on a road that they think is the right road. It's a good road. It's an easy road. It's a fun road. Let's all stay on it. And he says, I got bad news for you. That road eventually climbs a blind crest and falls off a cliff to destruction. It's narrow. It's particular. And it's hidden. And you're being invited in. Lastly, there are prophets in the world who are telling you and selling you the idea of the wide gate. They can't wait to invite you and tell you how wise you are and how great you are to find the gate. Listen to me, buy my product. Buy my course, subscribe to my YouTube channel, listen to my podcast, read my book, come to my conference. That doesn't mean that everyone who says those things is wrong or unwise. What it means is they're producing something in their life that you need to test to understand whether it's good or not. You need to test its fruit. Jesus has a whole analogy that he tells us that we talked about last week that says, you will know them by their fruit because bad trees can't produce good fruit and good trees don't produce bad fruit. So that's the test. Look at the fruit, taste the fruit, examine the fruit, and you'll know, is this good or is this bad? About 20 years ago, there's a company named Jelly Belly. At some point, probably 20, 25 years ago, we convinced ourselves that jelly beans were like an exotic quality product that we should invest in. So we elevated Jelly Belly as the like creme de la creme of jelly beans. And about 20 years ago, they came out with a product called Bean Boozled. Anybody ever seen the Bean Boozled box? So the Bean Boozled box is a real hit with kids because here's the way it works. It comes with a little spinny thing that you flick and the little arrow spins around. And in on the other side is a whole bunch of jelly beans. Now, the trick of the Bean Boozled box is that you spin the little deal and then it will point at one of the jelly beans and then you find that jelly bean out of the box and you eat it. Here's the trick. I'm going to read for you what it says. This one right here, for instance, says, when you get this little gray, white one that is, maybe it's that one right there at the bottom, you're going to get one of two flavors. You're either going to get a coconut jelly bean or a spoiled milk one. Or this pink one right here is either peach or barf. Or that one over there is berry blue or toothpaste. Actually, that one doesn't sound too bad. I'd probably eat that one. Or this one, buttered popcorn, or wait for it, rotten eggs. Now, I don't know what kind of sicko buys this thing and wants to eat these because I do not want a barf-flavored jelly bean because I can imagine how long that flavor hangs around in your mouth. But it's very popular with kids because here's the trick, right? Like, you get the jelly bean and you don't know as you're looking at the jelly bean, which one am I getting? Am I getting the delicious good one that I'm happy about or am I getting the one that is going to haunt me for the rest of my days? Here we go. We taste it. Right? You can see the analogy that Jesus is using here with fruit and where it works. I want to talk about a Marvel movie. There's a lot of Marvel movies. This is probably not news to you. I don't even know how many there is. I'm going to say 40. I think I'm in the neighborhood. And if you ask someone who's a nerd, what are the best ones, they'll give you a list. And you could also probably ask them which are the worst ones. And one of the ones that actually gets put on, that gets a lack of respect is this one right here, Iron Man 3. And I'm sure you're like, oh yeah, I know Iron Man 3. If you don't, I'll tell you all about it. Iron Man 3 is the third in a series of stories about a character named Tony Stark, who's a billionaire playboy inventor who makes a suit of armor that he flies around in and fights bad guys. And at the end of the first movie, he says, I am Iron Man. And then they make another one, which really wasn't that great. And then they make a third movie in which they wrestle with this statement, I am Iron Man, and they do something that's actually pretty surprising, and I really appreciate. Most of the movie has no Iron Man in it. It's just Tony. Tony's removed from his suit. He can't get back to where he needs to be and to get to his suit. And so he has to wrestle with, who am I really? Am I the suit that I wear and I show everyone else? Or am I really Tony who's on the inside and I have to wrestle with that version of who I really am? I think it's a really good movie. I would suggest you watch it. Here's what Jesus says. And before I get to it, I just want to say, I think this might be the hardest text in the entire script, into the entire Sermon on the Mount. This is the toughest one to wrestle with right here. Because this is what he says. Many will say to me on that day being Judgment Day, the day when everything is standing naked and exposed before God and judged. He says, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And didn't in your name we drive out demons and in your name perform many miracles? And I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. I want you to stop and notice for a second. He doesn't say, on that day, many people who never wanted anything to do with me and rejected me outright in public, I'll say I didn't know you. He says, many who said, wasn't I following you and wasn't I doing the things that you do in the world? And he'll say, I didn't actually know you. He'll say, on the day when you taste the jelly bean, whether you are peach or barf. And here's the trick. He seems to say that even the jelly beans themselves are unsure which one they are. And he doesn't say it's going to happen with a few people. He says many. There are many of you in the room right now. There are many of you standing on this stage right now. I'm standing here. I'm part of this. This is a sobering and terrifying reality that many of us will do all the things we think Jesus asks us to do and put on a good impression of him, and we will say, I am Christian. And at the end of the day, Jesus will say, did you really think that's what it was all about? Because I didn't even know you. That's sobering. And so the question that we're wrestling and the question I'm wrestling with is like, okay, so what do I do? What do we do in order to assure that on that last day we're not standing there exposed? Because the kingdom isn't about what you think or about what you say or about what you do. He says, here's a whole bunch of people that thought the right things, they said the right things, they did the right things, and at the end of the day, he says, you weren't in the kingdom, I didn't know you, we've never met each other. What the kingdom is actually about is who you are and who do you say he is. Who are you? And who is he? And how do you relate to him? Have you submitted yourself to him and walked through the narrow gate? Are you following his path or not? And I can't determine for you, and you can't determine for me. Here's what he says as he wraps it up. Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. And the rain came, and the streams rose, and the wind blew, and it beat against the house, and it didn't fall because it had the foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't put them into practice is like a foolish man who's built his house on the sand. And when the rain came, and the streams rose, and the winds blew, and they beat against that house, it fell with a great crash. Destruction found that house. So the question that we have to wrestle with is a very obvious one. Where are you building your house? Matthew Henry, who's a famous American pastor in the First Great Awakening, he says it this way: true wisdom consists in doing, not only knowing. It's not enough to hear Christ's sayings. We must do them, and that will evidence us as wise builders. Here's the trick. I don't know your heart, and you don't know mine. But you can see my fruit, and I can see yours. We can measure our lives and the way we choose to live against the wisdom that is presented to us in the Sermon on the Mount and in the rest of the scriptures. And we can encourage each other constantly to be found faithful. Because it's not about what you think, and it's not about what you say, and it's not even about what you do. It's about who are you at the core, and who have you submitted and entrusted your life to. It's not enough to say, I've done some scouting and I found where there's a good foundation place for us to build a house and then to walk away. The reality is you have to actually build the house. You have to get to work and you have to build something in that place. This is maybe my favorite part in the Sermon on the Mount. It's actually not in the sermon. It's the very end. It wraps up chapter 7. Here's what it says. And when Jesus finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Because he taught as one with authority, not as their teachers of the law. It gives us the response that people had to hearing this incredible thing. And then it leaves us with 3 questions that I'm leaving you with. Here they are. The first one is, are you amazed? I mean, have you listened to Jesus enough during this sermon to be amazed at his teaching? Has it rocked you at all? Has it put you off kilter? Are you shocked by the kinds of things that he says with real authority? Because this is the other thing. Do you recognize his authority? Jesus doesn't just write a good manifesto. He writes an authoritative document that says, here is the way the world works and where it's going. Do you hear his authority? He knows where it all began. He knows where it's all going, and he is in control of everything that has ever been made, including you. Do you recognize his authority? Do you submit to him? Have you heard him? Have you heard his voice? Matthew chapter 11, just a couple chapters after this is what Jesus is going to say. Whoever has ears, let them hear. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I'm gentle and I'm humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. We just spent this entire time saying, man, the Sermon on the Mount sets an expectation for living that seems so difficult to get to. But we've also said that the kingdom provides the resources you need in the grace and in the spirit that will transform you into the kind of person who can live in submission to the authoritative one named Jesus. And when we do that, you will find out the truth. His burden is light. His yoke is easy. And there's life found in that place. For those of us that have committed ourselves to following him, that's great news. If you're sitting here and you go, I don't know what I've done with this Jesus. I don't know what my answer to those questions would be. I have great news for you. The invitation is open, and there is good land to build a house in the kingdom. Let's pray that God would help us to be those kinds of people. God, we thank you so much for today. Thank you for the kindness of the wisdom found in the Sermon on the Mount, that you cared enough about us to send your son Jesus to teach us and to show us what it looks like to live in a kingdom that follows you. God, I confess in my own life how much I fall short. How many times I don't live this way. And yet I also confess that my hope is not in my performance, but in you and your grace alone. And I thank you for it. God, for anyone who's in the room that's wrestling with whether to follow you or not, I pray right now that your spirit would touch their heart, that you'd move in their life, you'd reveal yourself to them, and that their closed ears would open and they would hear the good news that is found in following you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.